So it's part of a twin project. The second paper is on the notion of the school, and I'm just going to reassure you that it has distinct sections, and so you'll know where you are during the paper. In his Éloge du Théâtre, Alain Badiou recognizes that philosophy has always situated itself and come to a sense of its own identity through a rivalry with theatre. And the stakes of this rivalry concern the aesthetics, or the presentation, or the logics of appearance of the city-state. Who shall bring the entire city-state to presence? Who shall articulate all of its regimes of appearance? The philosopher or the actor-poet? If philosophy were ever to vanquish theatre in this rivalry, or at least succeed in fixing it in one place, then theatre would end up condemned either to exile, a scapegoat banned from the city, roaming the hinterland, or it would be condemned to fuse with the reproductive spectacle and performativity of society, endless repetitions of the comedy of manners. But philosophy has not yet vanquished theatre. And as for theatre, well, it has not finished putting philosophers on stage in various guises, from Aristophanes' Socrates to the Prince of Denmark to Didi and Estragon in Waiting for Godot. Insofar as we pretend to do philosophy, we find ourselves in the thick of a rivalry with theatre, a rivalry over the appearing of the city-state. And in the midst of this rivalry, philosophy engages again and again in two strategies: thinking to secure a position of superiority. First, it seeks to develop the perfect legislation, a project I leave aside here. Second, it constructs the school. The school is conceived as a distinct body within the city that effectuates a philosophical education, that is, an education that will produce citizens, people capable of acting for the city-state. Furthermore, during the construction of the school, his philosophy will historically oscillate between two positions: between the school as propedeutic for life in the city-state, that is, as preparation, and thus there must be a wall between the school and the city, and the school as immediate microcosm of the city-state, playground as jungle, or classroom as startup incubator, take your pick. Within this oscillation between the school as propedeutic and the school as microcosm, one basic proposition will remain constant for philosophy, and that is we school to better the consistency of the city-state. And one further hypothesis: for philosophy to claim that it has successfully constructed a school, then it must have come to the end of its rivalry with theatre over the city-state. What then is the status of this rivalry and its stakes in Badiou's own philosophy? At the level of biography, Badiou has a long and fertile relationship with theatre, actor, playwright, essayist on theatre. In his latest essay, Éloge du Théâtre, he states that he has read all of the theatrical classics. And yet in the scholarship and commentary on Badiou's philosophy, to my knowledge, there has not yet been a sustained analysis of theatre and theatricality in his work. And so my first focus is going to be a definition of theatre that Badiou offers in L'Éloge du Théâtre. True theatre is the incarnation of an idea. Later, it's phrased as theatre, when it takes place, is the representation of an idea. My first question is very simple. What is the status of this definition within Badiou's philosophy? Now, coming from the first generation of Badiou commentators, I came of age with being and event, l'être l'événement. And so for me, the doctrine of conditions assumes primacy. Since this is a conference on Badiou, I will assume some familiarity with his work and go quickly here. So, part 2, the doctrine of conditions. Within set theory ontology, the process of structural transformation, termed a generic truth procedure, has the same ontological schema whether it occurs in the domain of art, or politics, or love, or science. There is nothing intrinsic in set theory which allows for the differentiation of generic truth procedures in these 4 domains. All occur through the gradual exploration of the consequences of an event. The doctrine of conditions states that the 4 domains of art, politics, science, and love alone give rise to generic truth procedures that structurally transform the historical situations in which they begin. If philosophy thinks and names the novelty of such procedures, they are said to condition philosophy. This is a normative definition of philosophy. A genuine philosophy in any age constructs its concepts in reaction to contemporary events and truth procedures. So, for example, Plato developed his philosophy in relation to the procedure of Greek geometry, the democratic city's trial of Socrates, the emergence of tragedy, and a complicated meditation on the role of love and desire in pedagogy. Part of the doctrine of conditions is an insistence on the difference between the 4 domains. Art is not politics, which is not love, which is not science. This, of course, has not always been the case in the history of philosophy. Marxism claimed to develop a science of politics. Benjamin opened up the possibility of a political art in response to fascism's aestheticization of politics. And the critical theorists and curators have never stopped chasing that mirage. Of course, there are interweavings and intersections between the 4 domains of art, politics, science, and love, but their intrinsic natures remain distinct. Because these truth procedures, these conditions, are infinite and indiscernible transformative practices, and because they occur more than once, it is impossible for philosophy to provide a definition of art, or a definition of science, or politics, or love. A condition of philosophy is thus not an object of philosophy, though philosophy can certainly attempt to reduce one of its conditions to the status of an object. This is the difference, Badiou notes, between Plato's and Aristotle's treatment of theatre. For Plato, theatre is quite clearly a rival. For Aristotle, on the other hand, it has become an object of study, and in some sense is thus domesticated, at least for the time being. Philosophy develops names for what happens in contemporary truth procedures, but in order to remain philosophy, it must not arrogate for itself the position of speaking the truth of art or politics, nor of becoming art or politics. Such would be a disaster in Badiou's terms. What philosophy must do, however, whilst remaining separate, is to think and conceptualize the compossibility of truth procedures occurring in the 4 domains. If it manages to do so, a systematic philosophy of its age will have been generated. So via the doctrine of conditions, Badiou's configuration is not philosophy, theatre, city-state, and school, as I set out, but rather 4 clear and distinct conditions, art, love, science, and politics, and 1 separate and distinct, yet systematic discipline, philosophy. Now the doctrine of conditions meets with two immediate challenges. First, the challenge of differentiation. What differentiates art, politics, science, and love? Ontologically, all generic truth procedures are the same, so this difference cannot be secured with the resources of set theory. Nor can it be secured by definitions, because neither of these conditions is an actual object of philosophy. So what to do? The second challenge is that of separation. If these generic truth procedures are infinite and indiscernible for the established knowledges of their historical situation, and if such generic truth procedures have conditioned philosophy in the past, such as with Plato's philosophy, how then can one secure an absolute separation between philosophy and its conditions? Is it not at least possible that parts of philosophy, as we know it today, are actually the continuing process of ancient truth procedures? As I argue in an article, Explosive Genealogy, part of philosophy, as we know it today, is actually theatre. In other words, when we do philosophy, we partly do theatre. The problem is we don't know this, and consequently, quite a lot of philosophy is very bad theatre. In the first book of Logique des Mondes, which develops a new theory of the subject, Badiou does develop a formal differentiation of art, science, politics, and love according to the following categories. So I'm just going to lay this out quite quickly. You have the categories of ontological foundation, evental trace, body, present as local, affect, and the present as general. And there you have the equivalents within a political procedure. And you have the same series of categories for artistic procedures, and there you see that the ontological foundation is the intensity of the sensible and the carnal forms, the evental trace is the formless becoming form, etc. So you have these series of formal operators that distinguish the four different domains. So there, at least within Badiou's work, I can say, well, there's an answer to my initial problem. The four conditions have been differentiated. But where does Badiou get these concepts from? Okay. Do they come from set theory ontology? No. Do they come from the phenomenology that is generated out of category theory? Well, then, no, not again. He's not engaged in political theory, he's not engaged in aesthetics, and he's not developing normative descriptions of politics and arts. At least it seems so. So the question is, where do these concepts come from? And beyond this level of specification, within Badiou's philosophy, how could one generate, or at least explain, the differentiation of the arts, the live arts, the visual arts, cinema, video, photography, sculpture, and beyond that, into a further level of specification, how could you explain the difference of genre? Like, would anything like the concept of genre survive this kind of conceptual apparatus? The difference between the still life, the pastoral, the portrait, etc. in painting. So the answer I hold to this, to my new puzzle, is this discourse in aesthetics. When philosophy is conditioned by an artistic truth procedure, when it attempts to name new truths that emerge from an artistic praxis, it generates new concepts inside a discourse, a philosophical discourse, called in aesthetics. These new concepts, for example, could be the concept of the event. So I hold, at least in the construction of L'être l'événement, that the concept of the event comes from the very close reading of Mallarmé's poem Un coup de dé. Badiou defines in aesthetics in the following manner. By in aesthetics, I understand a relationship between philosophy and art that, positing that art produces truths on its own, does not claim to turn art into a philosophical object. In contrast to the speculations of aesthetics, in aesthetics describes the strictly intra-philosophical effects produced by the independent existence of a few works of art. So I stress that phrase, the intra-philosophical effects, which for me gestures towards the idea that in some sense these conditions come to inhabit from the inside the space of philosophy in this work of conditioning. So it is quite possible for Badiou to generate concepts that surreptitiously do the work of aesthetics, distinguishing theatre from poetry, cinema, and the novel by means of names generated by a close philosophical analysis of a theatrical configuration. So what does Badiou's in aesthetics generate with regard to theatre? So there are two long essays on theatre, Rhapsody pour le théâtre, that came out in 1990, and this one, which is more recent, L'Éloge du théâtre, which came out last year. And that's in the form of an interview. And so it's in Éloge du théâtre that, as I mentioned before, Badiou does offer a definition of theatre. True theatre is the incarnation of an idea. Again, theatre, when it takes place, is the representation of an idea. However, and this is the problem, see, I keep on having problems, right? This definition itself does not emerge from the careful philosophical reading of a play, of a sequence of plays, of a performance, of a series of performances, or of the delimitation of a specific theatrical configuration. Now, of course, Badiou speaks of particular plays, of Corneille's Le Cid and Cortèse's Dans les Champs de Coton, and he mentions Antoine Vitte's productions at the Théâtre Chaillot. But there is no sustained, detailed investigation of a theatrical work of art, at least in L'Éloge du théâtre. Given the long, detailed analyses devoted to poetry, to Mallarmé, Rimbaud, Pessoa, Celan, or to novels by Rousseau and Julien Gracq in The Logics of Worlds, this absence is significant, the dissymmetry is flagrant. Not, however, and here I must admit that in contrast to Giuseppe, I'm a very bad philologist, and much to my disgust, after I'd written the abstract and sent the abstract, I suddenly remembered, well, of course, Badiou has written a close analysis of a play, not only in this work which has just come out, so this is the seminar from 2001 and 2004, it opens with an analysis of Le Balcon by Jean Genet, but also in Logics of Worlds itself, there's a fairly close reading of Les Mains Sales by Sartre during the opening, the very opening of the Theory of Points. But this definition, so to be, a little bit obsessional and picky, this particular definition itself still struck me because itself it didn't emerge from any particular theatrical truth procedure. So what is, still my question is, what is its status? And the clue that I found, and here I move into section 4, is that the incarnation of an idea, the bodily presentation of an idea, is also Badiou's term in Logique des Mondes for the appearance of a generic truth procedure. So in the preface to Logique des Mondes, Badiou speaks at length about the existence of ideas in Plato's language, or eternal truths in Descartes' language, and their presentation in a body of truth. A body in Badiou's phenomenology is the appearing of a truth. It has to render possible the thinking of a truth. It has to, I cite, manifest the visibility of the true within the existence of a world. And to produce that visibility, it needs the characteristics of separation, cohesion, synthetic unity, in short, of organicity. That's on page 76. At the level of appearing, thus, a generic truth procedure presents itself as separate, cohesive, synthetically unified, and organic. Now, does that remind you of anything in classical aesthetics? Are these not the eternal characteristics of the authentic work of art? So, what this means is that theatre, defined as the presentation of a true idea, or the incarnation of a true idea, and the appearing of a generic truth procedure, they are thus de-differentiated or undifferentiated at the level of appearance. The doctrine of conditions here does not differentiate theatre from any other truth procedure, at least at the level of appearing. Now, rather than pointing out an unfortunate classicism or an inconsistency in Badiou's philosophy, which is always dangerous with a philosopher of Badiou's class, and not particularly productive in itself, rather than nitpicking, let's take this as a jumping-off point for our own theses on theatre and appearing. If the definition of theatre and the definition of the appearing of any body of truth, of any incarnation of an internal and eternal idea are the same, this is because the presentation of a generic truth procedure is inherently theatrical. Or, stronger still, theatre is the presentation of truth procedures. Now, beyond hyperbole, the interest of such a thesis is it offers us a non-representational understanding of theatre. And in doing so, it takes up one of the great challenges of modernist theatre and of post-Heideggerian critical theory and of post-structuralism, each of which engages in a critique of representation and spectatorship. So, you find the critique of representation and spectatorship more or less everywhere in post-structuralism and in post-Heideggerian critical theory. You find it in Nancy and Le Coulebart in a text entitled Scène. Lyotard talks about moving beyond the theatre of representation in the introduction to libidinal economy, etc., etc. What do all of these commonalities add up to? Quite simply, another de-differentiation, another erasure of possible boundaries and distinctions. Post-structuralist theory, post-Heideggerian critical theory, doubles or rather joins modernist theatre in its attempt to generate presentations that are not representations, presentations that call upon the reader-spectator to become more than a reader-spectator, to become a participant, to engage in the dance of subversive interpretations. The doubling of theatre and praxis in Badiou's philosophy is thus an echo of something that took place in Derrida, in Deleuze and Guattari, and in Lyotard's writing, insofar as there we find a doubling of modernist theatre and the praxis of theoretical writing. So this de-differentiation of categories, this fusing, this confusion between theatre and praxis is not something that happens in Badiou's work alone. But another point is that it's entirely natural for Badiou to share this problem with other philosophers, because the corrosive erasure of boundaries does not end in post-structuralism's affair with modernist theatre. As a philosophical discipline itself, aesthetics, as we know from the third critique, is not necessarily, and perhaps not even primarily, concerned with works of art and with their evaluation. Aesthetics, as its etymology indicates, is concerned with presentation in a broad sense, with what comes to sense, as Rado reminded us earlier on through his investigation of sensibility. So our thesis then is that theatre is the presentation of truth procedures as they take place in historical situations. The appearance of a truth procedure, whether scientific, amorous, artistic, or political, is theatre. Theatre takes place as a very particular and rare kind of presentation, the aesthetics of a generic truth procedure. But the definition of true theatre is not the only place that we find theatre, or an arche theatre, as I term it, at work in Badiou's philosophy. We also find it in some of the fundamental articulations of his work. So, as I mentioned before, at the very beginning of this seminar, given between 2001 and 2004, and recently published, Badiou develops a reading of Jean Genet's play Le Balcon. It's not a close reading like his treatment of Mallarmé's poem Un coup d'idée in Lettres l'Événement, but perhaps that's due to the actual forum, which was the open, big seminar. and it does stretch over 2 sessions, and it does contain long citations of dialogue from the play. Here I do not have time here to go into the details of Genet's theatre and Badiou's reading, which is very complicated. My concern here is pragmatic. What does Badiou's reading of that play, Le Balcon, generate? Well, it generates a 4-part matrix which will serve throughout the entirety of this 3-year-long seminar as an analytic framework designed to produce images of the present, images of the times. And the 4 parts of this matrix are named as follows, and excuse my rough translation. First, we have the systemic or structural moment of order. Second, we have the exceptional moment. Third, we have the moment of raw or naked power. And fourth, we have the moment of the emblem. In the actual seminar, the strategy is to begin with an analysis of the emblem. And in the play Le Balcon itself, it's the police chief, the character of the police chief in a brothel who incarnates raw power. And he's very upset in the beginning of the play because nobody comes to play his character within the brothel, because clients usually go to the brothel and pretend to be a bishop or pretend to be a judge. They assume the symbols of power. And he's upset because nobody wants to play the role of the police chief. So he's different to the standard symbolic, the symbolic places in the order of that structure of society. So he represents raw power, but he does have an emblem. And in the shift of the order, the social order that's dramatized in the Balcon, he comes to have a new symbol, which is quite simply the phallus, much to the delight of Lacan when he analyzes the play. But within Badiou's analysis, the emblem for our times, once we use this analytic framework, this 4-part analytic framework, the emblem for our times is democracy. So how does Badiou engage in the analysis of the emblem democracy? Well, first of all, we should state that the emblem is that which serves to educate and to guarantee an order given the ordeal of its exceptions. So an emblem is what manages to guarantee and maintain in place a structural order, despite the fact that there are troubles and disturbances, such as the revolt that's going on outside the brothel in Le Balcon. So in order to analyze this function of the emblem as democracy, Badiou engages in an investigation of the status of jouissance, or enjoyment, through an examination of Lacan's claim that philosophy doesn't want to know anything about jouissance, via a polemic against Jean-Luc Nancy's conception, his anti-Lacanian definition of jouissance, via an updating, a mise au jour, of Plato's critique of democratic desire in Book 8 of the Republic, and finally through a reading of Pierre Guillotin's Tombeau pour 500,000 soldats. And this investigation of jouissance has as its outcome the following 3 crucial theses. And I must say that coming back to Badiou's seminar after some time, a little bit of time outside the academy and having finished my PhD and kind of left that behind, these particular theses absolutely struck me. This was before Logics of Worlds came out. This was when I was actually beginning the translation of Being an Event, and these struck me and they remained in my memory. So the first thesis, there is no world. We live in the interval between 2 worlds. The second thesis, there is no world because there is no logics of appearance, no hierarchy of appearance, no proper structuring of appearance, just a commercial equivalence or commodification or a democratic indistinction of bodies, a universal substitutability of objects. And the third thesis, which is part of the same ensemble of thought, there are not enough names for those who live in the world, or there are those who live in the world who are not named, who are not yet named. So I'm just going to leap, without following the arguments behind these theses in their detail, I'm just going to leap to the outcome. This analysis and these theses actually produce the image of the present that Badiou terms democratic materialism. That is to say, the hegemonic ideology of the current times that states there are only bodies and languages, to which he opposes an ideology drawn from his philosophy, materialist dialectics, which states there are only bodies and languages, save that there are also truths. So this image of the present times, democratic materialism, is ultimately generated from his reading of, and thus conditioned by, Le Balcon. Moreover, this image of the present times, democratic materialism, plays a crucial role in the preface to Logique des Mondes. The opposition between the hegemony of democratic materialism and the promise of a materialist dialectics sets up again, or rather restages, the entire project of his philosophy. So it is at this point that I'm going to risk a second hyperbolic thesis on theatricality in Alain Badiou's philosophy. So the first thesis was theatre is a presentation of truth procedures, and now my second thesis is that theatre is the articulation of a consistent world of appearances. What does this mean? Le Balcon, whilst it stages the reproduction and maintenance and updating of a social structure under the test of an event, that is, a revolt outside the brothel's walls. And it stages the repetition and the adjustment of this order through the erasure of the event. And whilst it does stage the endless substitutability of images, it nevertheless does articulate and separate disjoint orders or regimes of appearance. There is not just the brothel and the interchangeable roles of bishop, judge for the clients. There is also the moment of the revolt outside the brothel. There is also the moment of raw power, the police chief, and then there is a new emblem or image for the police chief, the phallus. So the play dramatizes a gap between the hegemonic and monotonic order of the appearance of a world as a brothel via an interchangeability of roles, and the diverse and disjoint orders of appearance that interact in the actual maintenance of that monotonous world. It so happens that the preface to Logique des Mondes does exactly the same thing. It dramatizes a gap between a hegemonic, monotonous world of democratic materialism and a set of diverse events and truths that could open up a tonic and articulated world of appearance. So the second thesis, theatre is the articulation of a consistent world of appearances. I have two pieces of evidence backing up this thesis. The first is the role of Sartre's play Les Mains Sales in elaborating the theory of points, which is a theory of decision and of action in Logique des Mondes. And at the same time, it's a theory of the distinction between an atonic or monotonous or flat world and a tonic world. It's only in a tonic world that truth can be incarnated in a praxis through a series of decisions. So there again, we have a play Sartre's Les Mains Sales, Dirty Hands, playing a crucial role at a moment in Badiou's oeuvre where the theory of action actually takes place. Now the second piece of evidence is not internal to Badiou's work, but it does act as a condition of my own philosophical investigations, and that is Shakespeare's theatre. In particular, the tragedy of Hamlet, which I hope you all recognised immediately. So, what does Hamlet actually stage for us as a play? There are very quickly, 5 points. First, a multiplicity of registers or orders of appearance, rumour and illusion and shadows versus substance, youth versus old age, the gaudy charade of Claudius's court versus the cold night on the battlements and the imminent threat of war versus the authentic inner subjectivity of Hamlet's grief, the living versus the dead, the present versus the past, thought and action, the English and the Danish and the Norwegians, women and men, augury or prophecy or destiny as figures of necessity versus immediate action amidst contingency. The second point is that Hamlet offers us an interrogation of the varying degrees of intensity of these orders of appearance and of their possible confusion or interpenetration. When is it that the dead act amongst the living? When is it that shadows take on the form of substance? Third, Hamlet stages for us a continual attempt by Hamlet's antagonists to sound, to test the depths of his own performance of madness. In other words, Claudius and Polonius attempt to bridge the gap between different orders of appearance. The devices they use are spying. They continually hide behind curtains in this play. They instrumentalize others to spy on Hamlet and so betray him, using his former friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and his former lover, Ophelia. And they also use traps. So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, when they sail with Hamlet to England, have with them a secret letter to the King of England asking him to immediately execute Hamlet upon reception. In contrast, and this is the fourth point, Hamlet also uses a device to sound the difference between two different regimes of appearance. The regime of his father's ghost and the story that it tells of his father's assassination, and the regime of appearance of Claudius's own conscience, which is represented in a confessional monologue. And the device that Hamlet uses to test the accord, or the difference between the ghost story and Claudius's conscience, is of course the play, the famous play within the play, The Mousetrap, which holds up a mirror to nature and succeeds in outing Claudius's guilt. Finally, fifth point, Hamlet stages Hamlet's own conscience of three broken fidelities to events, three obscured truth procedures or architheatres. His mother's broken fidelity to the memory of her husband, old Hamlet, the court's broken fidelity to old Hamlet's reign and its embrace of Claudius's reign, and finally Hamlet's own broken fidelity to Ophelia. So to conclude, what is theatre in Hamlet's own hands? It is a device that bridges and thus also articulates and exposes the distance between disjoint orders of appearance, so as to render possible a new political praxis in the hands of Fortinbras, the young Norwegian prince who comes on stage in the very last scene. At the same time, theatre brings to light those political praxes that have been betrayed and those amorous praxes. The very existence of disjoint orders of appearance is the trace of a buried architheatre of forgotten or obscured praxes. Theatre, when it happens, and it doesn't always happen, fuses with a buried architheatre and opens the possibility of a new architheatre. That's the third thesis on theatre. Any political theatre, any political truth procedure that remains ignorant of its own architheatre risks oblivion. Any theatrical truth procedure that remains ignorant of the architheatre of its times risks oblivion. Any philosophy that seeks to construct the school but remains ignorant of the architheatre of its times risks oblivion. Thinking and presenting the architheatre of praxis, this is how the play is the thing that will catch the king.
Nyní je čas na vaše otázky nebo komentáře. Můžete je položit v češtině, v angličtině nebo francouzštině. So now it's the possibility to ask or comment, and you can pose your questions in Czech, English or French.
Thank you, Oliver. I would ask you, can you get back to the three theses, just to have them there? And although I find completely appealing, consistent, and sharp what you said, I cannot refrain myself from doing the mental experiment of a substitution of the term theatre with something else. The problem being that the substitution wouldn't be that much simply with something like poem, for instance, or another term within the art procedure, but itself with whatever we find in an art procedure and a scientific procedure and so on and so forth, namely a body, a single point of incarnation for the situation of a subjective moment depending from an event. And I am under the impression that I can quite easily substitute here theatre or archi-theatre as you presented as every moment in which I have a body. For instance, a body is the presentation of truth procedure. In a body, a truth procedure is for the here and now. Secondly, it articulates the contrast between the appearance of a truth procedure and a consistence of a word. In a body, I have the whole word that is put in the test of this or that, of a radical alternative, the consistency of the word or the inconsistency of the truth procedure that is coming to take a new consistency. And thirdly, a body, most important, is never only the unfolding of a single event, but is that which is posited between two events. Because an event will have been an event only once that the infinity of its consequences will have been deployed, but the infinite deployment of the consequences of an event is always for an event which was before. You know, a body is that which reactivated an old event which has been betrayed for a new one that has to be verified. So my point is that theatre at this point so important to be the one name for these 3 points? Or is it rather theatre that which has something that epitomizes something which is specific to art procedure, which is the numericity of the immediate numericity of its audience? The one point is that which theatre has not immediately in common with other art procedures, but has in common with politics, is that it immediately speaks to everyone. That being, by the way, what Rancière claims being the one reason of the exclusion of theatre, that indistinctly appeals to the totality of the common.
Okay, so should I manage to turn this off? No. So if by body you mean an incarnation of truth, which is the terminology in Logique des Mondes, then yes, of course, there is an equivalence in between my term theatre and the term body. If, on the other hand, you mean body in terms of
Yes.
a kind of object, then no, absolutely not. But one thing that I should say is that part of the motivation of this particular construction of the figure of archi-theatre is, I think, that it better serves to expose how a praxis, a body of truth, rearticulates a world and generates a far more complicated transcendental than the kind of flat transcendental, the substitutability of all objects that you find under democratic materialism. And that's because I think that theatre has a vocation to precisely stage and also bridge the gaps in between different orders of appearance, even in its performance at the level of the stage, level of the actors' bodies, accidents in the actual audience, problems with the text, etc., etc. that's a specificity of theatre that is evident even when it's filmed and televised and turned into a video. And the other reason why I'm insisting on the specificity of theatre in Badiou's work is because it's part of a larger project, which is a realist approach to political action and the appearance of political action, whether in a revolutionary praxis or in ordinary politics, parliamentary politics, or whatever. And it's actually, you know, in the sequence to this particular investigation that I start to draw out various consequences of this Arche theatre for the assumption of there even being people, proper names or persons, who act in politics. You know, and arguing that, you know, our very way of thinking about politics as a responsibility of this prime minister or this president who made this decision after pressure by this lobby group, that whole vocabulary is absolutely theatrical and is like an interpretive grid that we impose on the actual events and tendencies of a political situation. So it's within that larger context that you see the motivation of the use of the term theatre rather than body.
But that entails a different
So, another questions?
Thank you. So I have kind of a question and a hypothesis, like, because I find it very dangerous to try and pin the word truth to art in any way. Or, I mean, if you consider that the task of art is to kind of expand truth. Like, the moment of art is when it creates something, some new idea which becomes or a hypothesis for truth. And so the thing is that art is only has this very short life, in that it really only like lives in this moment when it's new, and then after that we can we put it in the museum and we have to catch up and learn it, you know. And I think in this sense, I agree with you that it's important to talk about theatre not as kind of studying the text of a theatre once it's kind of not new anymore, but to study it in the moment of the performance, because then it you know can be renewed, or it is like actual. And I'm just wondering about this thing that you have, the correlation between theatre and philosophy and politics may be this thing that it also kind of functions on the same principle, that when you present me with a new idea, that is the moment of the philosophy or the theatre or the new, like the premiere. And then, but the reason that you can have a repetition, like that you can, you know, have a similar discussion in theatre or politics or philosophy, that they behave kind of the same, is because you always have it with a different group of people, and so that moment of continuing the discussion is never the same. And that, for me, this is the reason why they, you know, because the reason, we don't, maybe we have to do theatre in a particular way because it's theatre, but the reason that philosophy works maybe in a similar way is because we do philosophy in a form like theatre, in this situation, you know what I mean? And politics may be the same. That if you did politics or philosophy in a different way, where you don't have this situation of bringing something new to a group of people and then bringing the same thing to another group of people, then it would behave differently than theatre. That's my question.
So, yeah, thanks for the question. The first point is that when art is spoken of in the same breath as truth, it's important to remember that for Badiou, truth is never a set of finite statements about the nature of the world, the nature of the universe, or anything like that. Truth is a fidelity to an event. It's a series of actions. and it's singular, and there are many different truths that can happen within art and also within the art that we know as theatre. The other point that you made about art being short-lived and the whole question of live theatre, I think that's really important, and I would, for me, like, if I were to interrogate that philosophically, I would look at Alan Capro's Happenings and the whole movement of the reenactment of happenings that's occurring right now. So that's like a fundamental question for the contemporary world of performance, is what is it to reenact one of Capro's happenings and to make it come alive again when it was precisely supposed to be something that it was only ever a once-off. And I think that in the end, this particular argument is going to take me towards a pleading for live theatre, a pleading for live politics and live philosophy. And I think this is really important because one of the things, and this is on a tangent, but one of the things that I loved reading about Robespierre when I was working on the French Revolution was apparently he was the only man who could walk down all the streets of Paris, and there was no street lighting at the time, all the streets of Paris without being physically assaulted. Right? You had a pretty good chance of being physically assaulted if you were just n'importe qui and you walked down the streets of Paris and you get a purse on you. But he could do that because he was the only one who could circulate in between the Jacobin clubs, physically be in a Jacobin club and participate in that conversation, and then go to the Assemblée Nationale across the road and participate in that conversation without betraying one or the other. So what that meant was that materially and physically he could come into certain groups of people and be okay. He didn't have any bodyguards, he didn't have any black SUVs. So I think that I am going to end up with a pleading for live theatre and for the live arts on the basis of this argument, precisely because, you know, la salle, you know, the room, the theatre hall is precisely a scene of materiality, of diverse and disjoint regimes of appearance as well. And the other point that you raised about paying attention to the performance of theatre, the other point is that theatre, I kept on saying theatre doesn't always happen. You can go to a performance of Molière or of Hamlet, and theatre might not happen at all, because it might be a really bad performance. It might be flat. You know, the text might be truncated, the actors might not succeed in breathing life into the lines, and you don't actually have theatre there, because you haven't got that articulation of different orders of appearance. You just have, you know, a stylized and flat performance of a great classic, and when that happens, yes, it's a museum piece.